This morning we are walking our way, we're continuing to walk our way through the book of Daniel. And for the last 2 weeks, we have focused on Daniel chapter 4, which is the story of Nebuchadnezzar's liberation from pride. Okay, the story of this wicked, ruthless Babylonian king who learned to humble himself before God. But this morning, we're picking up the story in chapter 5. And in this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar has now been dead for many years. And whatever hopes there were in Babylon for reformation and justice have died with him. And in chapter 5, a man named Belshazzar is now on the throne, and he's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And the writer of Daniel paints his character in a few skillful strokes. The first thing that we're told about him is that he's throwing a party for 1,000 nobles. Okay, this massive party. And in the first 4 verses, one verb gets repeated 5 times. It comes up over and over and over to emphasize the main activity at this party. Okay, so as I read this, let's see if you can figure out what the writer wants us to understand is the main activity at this party. Okay, Daniel chapter 5, starting with verse 1. It says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. What does the writer want us to understand is the main activity at this party? Drinking wine. That's what's going on. And there were women at this banquet. And you should know that for an ancient royal banquet, that was a little unusual. But you notice that these women are all part of his harem. They're his wives and his concubines. And they're drinking as well. Okay, these women would be at a party like that for one reason and only one reason. Now, the writer is using fairly restrained language, but he's making it very clear that Belshazzar is giving free rein to any appetite that he wants to indulge. And he encourages those around him to do the same. And on this occasion, because habitually indulging any appetite gets boring after a while, okay, sin always follows the law of diminishing returns. He has an idea to kind of spice up this party. And he remembers the goblets that his father, Nebuchadnezzar, acquired many decades earlier that were taken as plunder from the temple in Jerusalem. And they were considered sacred to Daniel and his people. But this king decides that it would be kind of entertaining, might take away a little bit of the boredom factor, to take these sacred vessels, these goblets, these objects of holiness for a conquered and exiled people and use them for a drunken orgy to mock their God. Now, I want to make a comment here. If you look at verse 2, the beginning of it could sort of be interpreted this way. While he was under the influence of wine, he gave orders to bring in the goblets. The implication being that alcohol prompted him to do what he would never do otherwise. Now, a word about this. The use of alcohol is like hotly debated amongst believers. This is one of those hot button topics. You talk to different believers, you get very different ideas about the whole thing. For instance, in some Christian circles, it's considered a sin, okay? John Ortberg talks about the community where he grew up. He says, I grew up in a church tradition where we took great pride in never touching wine. One of the ways you could tell spiritual people from carnal people amongst my folks was that spiritual people never let wine touch their lips. This made certain sections of Scripture kind of embarrassing. We never, for instance, talked about verses like Psalm 104:15. God makes wine that gladdens the heart of man. We never talked about how Jesus turned water into wine and how Jesus actually drank wine. We didn't mention that because it's embarrassing to admit that you're a part of a system that ends up saying you're more spiritual than Jesus was. So there's just no way to argue biblically that Jesus is against all consumption of alcohol. There's just no way. Okay, he drank wine, he made wine, his first miracle was turning water into wine. He instituted communion to participate. His followers would need to drink wine. So to have entire communities of Christians forbid it seems odd. To treat all consumption of alcohol as sin is odd. To use it as a spiritual boundary marker, like this way to separate the sheep from the goats, is odd. It's incredibly superficial, and it's wrong. But I have also, completely on the other hand, I have seen believers, followers of Jesus, go absolutely buck wild with alcohol. Several years ago, Jen and I were invited to this weekend getaway, and this was actually before we even started Brookview. And we were up in this cabin up in the mountains, and the people that invited us called this thing Hope Lodge, and this is way back. So Jen and I were in our 20s, if you can imagine that. And so was everybody else there. So it was all these 20-somethings. Most of them were kind of newly married within a year or two or less. And some of the couples that were invited to this came from a church in Mount Vernon. And so there were 30 or 40 of us up there, and maybe 8 of them had all kind of come together from this church in Mount Vernon. And they were kind of different. They were this strange mix, if you can imagine this, of anti-establishment and super hyper intellectual. So every other word was like F this and F that. But then they'd quote from the great Christian reformers like Wesley and Calvin and Luther. And then they'd quote the great philosophers, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Hume, Descartes. And they wanted to talk about all the hot theological issues. God's sovereignty versus, human free will. The ins and outs of the nature of the Trinity. The exact meaning of the words like propitiation, sanctification, sacerdotalism. They wanted to look to the rest of us like they were really intellectual, but they were also super anti-everything. They wanted to use a lot of big theological words mixed with F words. And then they wanted to drink wine, like expensive wine. And they wanted to talk about the unique nature of the vineyards and how you could taste just a hint of whatever. They wanted to be refined and educated and theological and really crass. And it was like this super odd mix. And so at night, when they cracked open the wine, it was like a dam broke. It's like they just pop bottle after bottle after bottle. And they would stammer around, mumbling about Nietzsche. And then the conversation would take kind of a drastic downturn, and it would just get vulgar, all sexual and all kinds, as they would just get sloppy drunk. And the spiritual arrogance, mixed with the inebriation, was super irritating. So for the rest of us, we're we can't even be in the same room with you guys. We just let you have your own little drunken Nietzsche party. And we were just wow, maybe you guys should have called it quits after 8 glasses. When you could still pronounce Kierkegaard and propitiation. And somehow, this kind of thing for them became ingrained in their church culture. Their pastor was with them for this and was leading them in the whole thing. And apparently, in an effort for them to avoid legalism, they'd adopted this absolutely no restraint approach. And they drank like this, apparently, pretty much whenever they got together. Alcohol was always central to their gatherings. So you have this whole other end of the spectrum. Now, I made a decision a long time ago to be very careful with alcohol. And I don't know if you know this. Alcohol impairs judgment. Drinking too much, it disables that filter, that part of our brain and our spirit that stops us from doing dumb or bad or dangerous things. Now, I don't know about you, But I have a really hard time making good decisions when I'm fully sober. I need my filter to be engaged. I need that thing to be fully operational. So if I have a beer or a glass of wine, which I sometimes do, I'm very, very, very careful about amount. And then there's the issue of addiction. For me, okay, which I can be prone to for sure, and also for people around me. And I would guess that in a room like this, almost all of us have known people whose lives have been ravaged by alcoholism. Before Jen and I moved down here to start Brookview, I did a 1.5-year stint working, and many of you know this, in an oil refinery up in Ferndale. And one of my good friends on my crew there was a woman named Cindy. And she was older than me by about 5 years or so, I'm guessing. And then she was a beautiful lady. She turned a lot of heads in the refinery working there, which was not all that hard to do. But she was a very competent lady. I mean, she did her job well. And she was just really good to me, like from day one. She watched out for me, and she kept me out of trouble and dangerous situations, and she helped me learn the job. And when they were laying people off after about a month of my time out there, she made sure that I didn't get laid off, and she helped me keep my job. And she was just a sweet, sweet soul. But she had an alcohol issue. And it turned out that it was a big one. And in my 1.5 years there, toward the end of it, I just watched her absolutely spiral. And she started missing work a lot, like for days at a time. And everybody knew her and her background, and they knew that she'd been on a big, huge bender. And she was a great worker, okay? She was really good at her job, and people loved working with her. She was a sweet lady. And so our boss was incredibly gracious with her for a while. But then after missing several days and getting warned and missing several days again, and then coming into work and really not being herself and not being productive and smelling of alcohol, shortly after I moved down here, I heard from my friends back home that she got fired. About a year later, I heard from those same friends that she died. That she essentially drank herself to death in her early 30s. In her early 30s. I mean, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. She was a beautiful woman, and there was so much potential and so much good in her, but it was gone. Now, I bring this up because almost everyone in this room has experienced this on some level, I'm guessing. And it may not, with people you know, have led to physical death, but almost all of us have seen a life somewhere along the way that has been devastated by alcoholism. Okay, a mom or a dad, a friend, a brother, a sister, a neighbor. When it goes wrong, it goes like really, really wrong. And so, guys, we have to be so careful with alcohol for ourselves, okay, for our own sake, and for the sake of people around us. There are folks battling addiction all over the place. Recovering alcoholics or just still plain alcoholics or people that are impressionable in some way. And we need to think about how our use of alcohol affects them. Now, some of you have noticed, if you've been around here, that when we do communion, we use grape juice, okay, not wine. And there are two main reasons for that. First, this is a public high school. You cannot bring alcohol on this campus, even if you're a pastor, in the name of Jesus. Okay, second, like even if we were to get our own facility somewhere, we want to be sensitive to people that are battling alcoholism. Because imagine this. Let's say that my friend Cindy finally did get the help that she needed. And instead of drinking herself to death, she actually got treatment and she went into recovery. And then one day she went to church. And in worship, to remember the sacrifice of Christ, she drank wine again. And it triggered something in her and led her back down that road. Okay, that would be absolutely tragic. And so out of sensitivity, we use grape juice. And I just want to pause here and say, guys, alcohol is really, really dangerous. And I encourage you to think hard about your relationship with it. Now, the last thing that I want to do, and those of you that know me, you know this, the last thing that I want to do is prescribe some sort of legalism when it comes to just about anything. And different people have different limits with alcohol for sure. Okay, what's right for one person is not necessarily what's right for all. But I just want to encourage you this morning to think for a second, what is your current relationship with alcohol? Like, is there any kind of dependency? And I mean any kind. Like, I mean, do you think sometimes I need it? Do you rely on it? Do you need it to loosen up in certain, like, social situations? You know, a little liquid courage to help you cut it loose. Do you need it in order to have fun with certain friends? Or to relax, maybe to get intimate with your spouse? Or do you need it to wind down after a hard day? Or do you need it because you're just so stressed? You have to be so careful. It's addictive on so many levels. And when it goes wrong, it can go really, really wrong. Okay, now, that was a very long discussion about a very small detail of this story. And I get that. But this is something that we don't talk about very much. And it's really central to what's happening here. And it's a really, really important thing. Okay, back to the story. Belshazzar is sloppy drunk at this party. And he's making terrible decisions. And he is about to experience the world's most drastic intervention. Okay, verses 5 and 6. And try to get your mind around this. They're drinking, they're tearing it up, they're drinking out of these golden goblets that they've taken out of the temple in Jerusalem. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. I mean, envision that. In the middle of this like drunken orgy, the fingers of a human hand just appear like floating out of nowhere, and they begin to write on the wall next to the lampstand, okay, so everyone can see it. Now, my guess is that Belshazzar's first impulse is to wonder, like, if he's had too much Chardonnay. Maybe he ought to switch to coffee. But then he sees the hand, and he realizes it's real, and he sees the words, and he realizes this is real. And I like the way that his reaction to it gets translated in the old King James Version, okay, written like 400 years ago in ancient, like, English. It says, "Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another." You know something unsettling is happening when the joints of your loins go loose, and your knees start smoting one against another. Okay, verses 7 to 16. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale, and his nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So Belshazzar sees this message, but he can't understand it. And it terrifies him even more. But nobody can help him. None of his advisors or wise men can read the writing. Okay, but the queen, most likely Belshazzar's mother, she hears all the hubbub of what's going on in the banquet. She's not been a part of this, but she hears what's been going on. And she remembers an old advisor of Nebuchadnezzar's. So Belshazzar sends some men, and they track him down, and they get him out of bed in the middle of the night, and Daniel is brought into the middle of this room now. And you have to imagine what this would have been like for Daniel. I mean, we've been walking with Daniel through his journey. And he was a young man when he was captured in Judah, and he was brought to Babylon. It was the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Okay, but many years have gone by now. Daniel is now an old man. Okay, most likely he's in his 80s. During the reign of Belshazzar's father, Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel was elevated to being the king's right-hand man. Okay, he was the right-hand man to the most powerful king on earth. He was like the second most powerful man on earth. But he's now been so thoroughly discarded that this king doesn't even recognize him. He comes in and the king says, Are you Daniel? Not because Daniel's lost his ability, but because this king is a joke. But he doesn't want people around him who are going to speak hard truth. So Daniel and anybody like Daniel has been away from the palace for many, many years. But one glance tells Daniel what's been going on in this room. That this king, who's charged by God to serve his people, is only serving himself. And then Daniel sees the golden goblets. And he hasn't seen those maybe since he was a boy back in Judah. And Daniel thinks about home. His home that he's been forced to live away from his entire adult life. And he remembers maybe what it was like to gather with all of his people, thousands of people coming together to worship God in their sacred temple. And he remembers those vessels, those golden goblets that were so holy to them, that they were used for the deepest expressions of worship to God. And now, he sees what they've been used for. And this king who has trashed Daniel's career, forgotten Daniel's people, and mocked God, sees the writing on the wall. And he actually has the nerve to awaken Daniel in the middle of the night, have him escorted in so that he can ask Daniel for a favor. Tell me what it means, he pleads with Daniel. And if you can tell me, I'll give you gifts and I'll give you power. All right, verses 17 to 24. Then Daniel answered the king, You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox. And his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. And Daniel here confronts Nebuchadnezzar with a powerful idea. Just 2 words. And we're going to put them up on the screen. Daniel says to Belshazzar, you knew. It's bad enough that Belshazzar did such wicked things, but what's worse is he knew better. God had given him a front row seat for all that had happened with Nebuchadnezzar. He watched Nebuchadnezzar encounter God time and time again. He saw the same miracles as Nebuchadnezzar. He was there when Nebuchadnezzar went crazy, lost his mind, and then he watched him humble himself before God. And then he watched God bless him deeply. He saw God restore the kingdom to him with even more glory. He watched his father lead the empire with a new grace. He watched him learn to serve the people. He watched his father learn to care about justice, to use his throne to defend the needy and the poor and the broken. He watched his father come to revere God, to live out his life walking in faithfulness to God. He had seen repentance and great leadership modeled right before his eyes. And so Daniel says to him, you knew. Belshazzar, God revealed to you what is right and good, but you've chosen this life of selfish indulgence. You chose to rule without justice. You ignored the poor and the broken. You built your kingdom on the backs of slaves, and you wasted countless resources on parties while your people were starving to death in the streets. And if all that wasn't bad enough, you now mock the God that gave you everything. In your drunken state, you've done the unthinkable. Belshazzar, you knew. And I just want to pause here and ask you to think for a second. Is there something going on in your life these days where you know better? I mean, has God blessed you with enough wisdom about something that he could turn to you and say, hey, you knew? I mean, God sends us these gifts, people that help us understand, people that show us the way, experiences, insights. But it all gets wasted if we don't put it into practice. And so, is there something in your life these days, something going on where you know better? Because God is trying to bless you. He's trying to show you the way to life. And God is trying to make your life count, to use it to impact the people and the world around you. Maybe God has shown you something over the years. He's sent people to you or put you in a place where you have learned really important stuff. Maybe it has to do with managing your finances. Maybe it has to do with managing time. Maybe it has to do with how you prioritize stuff. Maybe it has to do with spending way too much time on the wrong things. And it's not that you had no idea, because you know. Maybe you're a mom or a dad, and you've been making work your idol, and your children are shriveling up inside, and you lose them a little bit more every day. But by keeping real busy and avoiding reflections, steering clear of deep friends that might speak truth to you, you can avoid thinking about reality. You're not looking at any of the signs, but deep down, you know. Or maybe you're somebody who just sort of lets anger fly. You use words that draw blood, that drip with sarcasm or contempt, and you just avoid studying the hurt look in the eyes of your children or your spouse or your friends or your coworkers because you don't want to know. And this goes on day after day, week after week, and you never admit what a problem you have, even though it leaks out of you all the time. Never seek the help you need. You pretend like your relationship to the world is just fine. But deep down inside, you know. We've seen that this call to humility for Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar specifically involves for them doing justice and helping the poor and the broken. Using all of the resources that God has just handed to them to be a blessing to other people, people that are hurting around them. And maybe you can kind of go through the routines of your day, just day by day, and just sort of have this tunnel vision. Just being blind to the needs of people around you. Because you're so locked into your agenda, your thing, that you don't stop to serve anybody. And maybe there are people at work or at school, maybe there are friends of yours that are really hurting. Maybe it's happening right inside of your home. You keep ignoring it all around you, but deep down you know. Whatever it might be for you. I have no idea what it might be, but whatever it might be, don't close your eyes. Don't close your eyes. Belshazzar knew better. He knew a day of reckoning was going to come, and now it had. And God writes on the wall 3 words. And each word is a unit of measure, like pound, ounce, half ounce. That implies that Belshazzar has been measured, that he's been evaluated. And Daniel now reads the message, okay, verses 25 to 31. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So Daniel gives the king the message. And we kind of wait for Belshazzar to respond. We wait for him to do what his father did, to do what Nebuchadnezzar did, to raise his eyes towards heaven, humble himself, and submit to God. We wait for him to do what the prodigal son did in Luke 15, fall to his knees and come to his senses. To do what the thief on the cross did next to Jesus, to acknowledge his sin and ask and plead and beg for mercy. But he doesn't. It's just silence in that room. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel is clothed in purple, a gold chain is placed around his neck, and he's proclaimed the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the most powerful man in the world, the king of Babylon, was slain. And he dies alienated from the God of heaven. And this is so tragic. His life essentially became a project of avoidance. He avoided truth. He avoided what he knew he should do. He avoided change. He avoided people that would call him out. He avoided the realities of broken people all around him. And he used alcohol and parties and distractions of anything he could find to avoid the realities of life. And he died empty and ashamed. But here's what I think is an even greater tragedy. It goes way beyond his life. I mean, did you notice that because of his life, because of his priorities, the entire kingdom is divided? Daniel's very clear. It says the kingdom of Babylon will be divided. Okay, the life, the choices of Belshazzar will affect thousands upon thousands upon thousands. Babylon, the entire kingdom would come crashing down. And that meant very, very real suffering for very, very real people. Now, here's the thing. In our culture, this is especially true. We tend to live with a delusion. We like to think, okay, this is my life, and I can do with it what I want. And I will deal with the consequences of my choices because they're my choices and they're my consequences. But the truth is, the consequences for our decisions are never ours alone. Our choices always affect other people. None of us lives life in a vacuum. What we do or don't do affects people around us. Okay, there are ripples that are always going out from our lives. Everything we do sends out ripples. Everything we do sends out ripples. When I was about 9 years old, I had a traumatic experience. I got my hands on a pack of Red Man Chew. And I went out to my treehouse in the front yard, and we had several acres, and so I went out to my treehouse, put on my tool belt, threw in a Red Man, and enjoyed brown spit. I was walking around the other side of my treehouse when I saw my stepdad in the yard, and I thought, uh-oh, because the chaw was like pushing my entire cheek out, and my stepdad said, "Hey, Jason," and I said, and he said, "Are you trying to avoid me?" And I said, "No, not at all." About a minute later, my mom came outside of the house and said, "All right, dinner's ready. Come on in, everybody." So we went in and we sat down to have pigs in a blanket. You ever have pigs in a blanket? Nice greasy sausage wrapped with a pancake smothered in Mrs. Butterworth's. It's my favorite thing in the world. And so we sat down for dinner, but as I was looking at that thing, I was starting to shake and like beads of sweat were forming and the room was spinning. And so I I was poking at it, but I couldn't eat it. And so my mom flipped out because I was the pickiest eater you've ever seen. And she and my dad had suffered through pigs in a blanket just so I would eat. So she says, that you will eat this. No, you will eat this. You will eat it right now. And so I took a bite, and I was like, that's all I can do. I was like, whoa. And I sprinted to the bathroom, and I threw up harder than I've ever thrown up in my life. I saw my shoes. It was unbelievable. And my poor mom was just like, "Oh my gosh, look what I did. I made him eat pigs in a blanket." It was traumatic. I remember it like it was yesterday. The smell of Red Man, still. Okay, now here's an important question. What is a 9-year-old boy doing out in a treehouse with Red Man? Well, here's what happened. I had this friend in the neighborhood that was older than me. His name was Vince, and he was like 2 years older than me. He was an athlete, and he was a really cool dude. And Vince chewed. And I thought, yeah, that's what cool dudes do. And so I chewed. Almost killed me. Now here's the point. As an 11-year-old boy in a neighborhood, he had this effect on me that he probably didn't know about. The choices he made affected me. And the reality is, every time you do something, it affects people. They're watching your life. They're watching what's happening. If you are a parent, your kids are watching you. There is no such thing as, it's my life, I can do with what I want, and the consequences, they will affect everybody around you. If you live with other people, everything you do affects them. If you're a young person, you go, well, it doesn't matter what. Your parents are deeply affected by decisions you make, far more than you probably realize. Your consequences aren't just your consequences. Everything you do sends ripples out over and over and over. And we all have seen families where one person brings the entire family down. I mean, decisions that they make, bad decisions, bring down the entire, you've watched families get blown apart. People, divorces, kids are scattered. It's awful because one person makes a horrible, horrible decision. And that person could say, well, it was my life, and no, they're not just your consequences. It happens in homes, it happens in schools, it happens in workplaces, it happens with organizations. One leader of an organization can make decisions that impact everybody throughout the organization. You're constantly sending ripples out. But the cool thing about that is, you can be constantly sending out negative ripples, or you can be constantly sending out positive ripples. Whatever you do, it affects people. And I was thinking about how significant this is. You take one life, you take one person who starts to say, I'm going to live humbly for the sake of other people with integrity, and you watch how many people are touched by that. I mean, the example that comes to mind for me in our church, and I've talked about this person before, is Tony Ellersick. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous the ripples that this guy has sent out over the last 8 years or so. I mean, in high school, he was going a certain direction with his life. His God was sports and self-glorification and partying and chasing girls and the whole thing. And then all of a sudden, God got a hold of him and said, I've got something better for you than that. And he surrendered to it. And he humbled himself. And he decided, I'm going to send out as many positive ripples as I can for the rest of my life. And if you've been around the guy, do you know what it's like? I love Tony. He builds up my ego. He tells me how awesome I am every time I'm around him. And I think he's sincere. As far as I can tell, he's sincere. Every message, he's like, dude, you killed it. I'm like, yeah. And he does it with everybody. I mean, he just notices. He's so focused on other people, and it's so sincere. He notices what people are good at. He's impressed by all the stuff everybody else does. Have you been around people like that are truly, genuinely impressed by other people all the time? It's amazing. You know what I can't stand is being around people that are impressed by nothing but themselves. It drives me nuts. And he invests time in people. And you talk to the different kids that he's impacted through his leadership in Young Life or youth group. You talk to his brothers and his family. You talk to his parents. You talk to everybody. And they're like, this kid has so significantly impacted me. And there are many, many, many of you. We could talk for hours about all of you guys. It's extraordinary. But here's the reality. God has handpicked you and said, I'm going to make you like this, and there's not going to be another person on the face of the earth like you. And I want you to be you. I want you to live with integrity. I want you to live with a passion for serving other people, and then watch what happens with your life. Watch what happens with your life. This king was given the most influence of any person on the face of the earth in that season of his life, and he just wasted it. And God has given you influence with your friends, with your family, with everywhere you go. And he's given you insight in how to use it, and he's given you a personality, and he's given you everything you are, and he's just saying, I want you to let me make you be fully you. And it's a decision we all have to make. What kind of ripples am I going to send out? Because you're sending them out.